So it was a cold winter's night, 1999, and I was a junior in high school. And on this particular Friday evening, I had a friend over, and my brother was out for the night. Now, here's what you need to know about my life at that time. In high school, I was considered the good kid. I was active in my youth group. I was a leader in the youth group. My brother, who was 3 years older at this time in life, his life was spiraling downward due to drug and alcohol addiction. He was gone for the night, and there was lots of fear because you didn't really know where this thing was going to end up. So me and this friend who was also from youth group, we went into his room. We knew he wouldn't be back until the wee hours of the morning. He was off partying. We go into his room, and we had a big metal trash can with us, and everything that we considered unholy made it into this big metal trash can. All of his t-shirts with his favorite bands, unholy. All of his CDs, you remember compact discs? Unholy, they made it in the big metal trash can. Empty cigarette boxes, half-empty booze bottles that were found scattered throughout his room. Those made it into the big metal trash can. Anything we considered unholy made it in, and then we dragged this big metal trash can up the stairs, through the living room, out the front door, through the driveway into the street, where we took some gasoline and poured it into the big metal trash can. And then we lit a match and threw it into the trash can, and we watched these things go in flames. And we felt good about ourselves because we were doing God's holy, sacred, righteous work. Now, at some point, as they do, big brothers come home. We had went to bed, still feeling good about ourselves, and about sunrise, Brandon comes rushing into my bedroom door. "Where's my stuff?" And I was still feeling good and proud and arrogant, so I pop out of bed. I said, "Your stuff is in that metal trash can, and it's in ashes because we burned it last night. And if you don't want to live like Jesus, then we're going to force you to live like Jesus." And I was fully prepared to take the beating of a lifetime. But that's not what happened. He looks at me, and you could see the pain and agony and betrayal in his eyes. And he said, "Seriously? You took my stuff and you burned it? What is wrong with you? Why would you do that?" And he turned around and he walked away. Fear led me to manipulation. Manipulation never works, and when it does, it's temporary. Fear led me to build barriers in the relationship between me and my brother. And you can imagine 2 years later when he was killed in a car accident, that fear was heightened. And I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know how to trust, and this thing actually affected the way I did relationships. Fear always builds barriers. My first semester in seminary, we were put into these small groups with other first-year students, and we were told that the goal was to do life together, to do that first year together. One of the students in my small group, who's now a friend of mine, but she was openly lesbian. And by this time in my life, I had resolved in my mind and heart that you could be gay and be Christian, and that Jesus wasn't all too concerned with one's sexual orientation, and if he was really silent about it. But what I hadn't resolved was that she was gay and wanted to be a pastor, getting her MDiv, her Master's of Divinity. As if she needed my permission, right? I hadn't resolved this. So the way I did this was just kept her at a distance, arm's length. You all have been there, done that, right? One of the assignments in the class was to share your faith journey with the group. You had to share your story. She was the last one to share at the end of the semester. When she started sharing her story, I could feel the barriers of fear crumbling. And when she got done with her story, it was a sense that, oh my goodness, I got this one wrong. Of course she can be a pastor. Of course she can. She loves Jesus the same way I love Jesus. God is working in her life in very similar ways God works in my life. Of course she can be a pastor. Fear creates barriers. And maybe you've had this happen before where you can look at someone and say, yeah, their mind is right. Their heart is right. Heart is good. But they're just not like me enough. We got to have some cultural conversion here. They need to be a little bit more like me. I mean, if we're honest, right? Sometimes we just want some cultural conversion. I still experience this. Fear, this kind of fear doesn't just go away in an instant, by the way. So take, for instance, sometimes I'll catch myself thinking when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think to myself, man, maybe they're just taking it too far. And I get the problem in it, right? A white guy living in Highlands Ranch telling black folk that they're taking it too far. And when I get stuck there, it's in my mind, and if I get stuck up here for too long, things get dicey. So I've got to come out of my mind. How do you do this? I have to hear the stories from real people and real situations, hear the stories of people who have had experiences that are radically different from my own. Fear always builds barriers. Just last week, I hit the send button on an email. And some of you are thinking, yeah, I did that 12 times already this morning. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. You've heard of people sitting on an email for 24 hours so you can reflect on it before you hit that button. Or maybe 48 hours, give it the weekend. I sat on this email for over 3 years. And I had all kinds of narratives of fear built around this email. And what it was it was an email where I was owning my wrongs in this particular relationship. It was an email where I was attempting to clean my side of the street. And the fear was, if I send this and I own my stuff, does it mean this other person is off the hook for the wrongs that they've committed? And what if I actually send this email and this person gets to receive all the benefits of grace that I've experienced? I'm not sure they're worthy enough. I'm not sure they deserve it. When I hit send on Thursday afternoon, there was a flood of emotions because I knew those barriers of fear were crumbling. And have you ever set out to do something good and you've tried to set someone free, and in the process you find out the one being set free is actually you? Fear always creates barriers. Leave me to myself long enough and I'll create more barriers of fear than can fit in this room. Thank God for Galatians. Paul wrote Galatians for people like me. So let's jump to Galatians, shall we? So if you go home later today and you want to read Galatians, I'm sure you all have already read it, but say you want to read it again, here's how you find it. It's in the New Testament. Here's how the New Testament goes. Just a little review. This will be on the test. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. Acts, Romans, and then 2 more letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now here's a trick I'm going to teach you because my mom taught me when I was a kid and it stuck with me. After 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you have General Electric Power Company. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Some of you are never going to forget this now. General Electric Power Company. Now a little review of Galatians. Oh, but before we review Galatians, a word about the Bible and when we read it, when we interpret it. Because you can't really read it without interpreting it, right? Let the context be the context. And the context, when we're looking at the Bible, is always real people and real situations in a real world dealing with real things. Let that always be the context. If we read Galatians and we divorce the context from the text, well, then what we have are theological conversations that hover up here. Those are always really, really boring. Or as my 3-year-old would say, Poppy, that's bowing. Really boring. They don't lead anywhere. They're a waste of time. We actually have to do the hard work of bringing those ideas down and make sense of them and ask the questions like, why does this first century letter matter? What does it have to say to us in the 21st century? How can we enter into the story? How can we enter into the dialogue? And when it comes to Galatians, there's a very real context, real people in a real crisis, and Paul is really passionate about what's happening here. So a little word about Paul. Paul was a missionary. He traveled from city to city starting different churches. He comes to this city called Galatia and starts and establishes a church, and then like missionaries do, he moves on. Soon after his departure, he hears about what's happening in Galatia and the church there, and things aren't going well. So essentially, the entire 6 chapters of this letter to the Galatians is Paul saying, what in the heck happened here? What has happened to you guys? Here's what happened. A group of people came after Paul, and most scholars will say that these were also Jewish Christians like Paul, but they were totally sold out to Mosaic law, meaning they were totally sold out to the 10 Commandments and all the 600 plus other laws that we read about in books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And they were saying to this church in Galatia, yes, of course Jesus is the Messiah, we get that. And yes, of course we could welcome people into this faith. But y'all are doing it wrong. You know that. You're doing it wrong. Because you can't just welcome them in. You see, not everyone is worthy of God's love. There's got to be some rules and regulations around this thing. There's got to be some cultural conversion here to welcome in the Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles? Anyone who's not Jewish. There's got to be some cultural conversion here. They've got to become like us. The males, you see, they need to be circumcised, like us. Because this will show that they are descendants of Abraham, which goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 17. And they also need to live like us. They need to adopt the Jewish way of life and earn their approval through the works of the law. Earn their way to God through the works of the law. Now here's the thing. The church in Galatia actually bought it. So Paul writes this letter to the beloved church in Galatia. And Paul is passionate about this, and he uses some pretty harsh language. So here we go. You're going to get an overview of Galatians in about 36 seconds. Are you ready? Chapter 1, right after his greeting. He says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Chapter 2, he reminds them, don't you remember? Jesus came to fulfill the law, not abolish it. He says, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. So he's throwing his Jewish audience a little bone here. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. Chapter 3, are you so foolish? After you started with the Spirit, are you now finishing up with your own human effort? You were given this thing called grace through Christ, and now you want to try to work your way there? Chapter 4, how can you want to be enslaved again? I'm afraid that my work for you may have been wasted. Chapter 5, you have fallen away from grace, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. Paul is passionate about this. He is absolutely relentless in his opposition to some different gospel. Why? Paul says, this is my story. Don't y'all get it? Man, I live this way. I live this way. In another letter, he says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I knew the law better than anyone. I lived it to a T. I spent my time trying to work my way to get God's approval. It's exhausting. It's destructive. I've been there, done that. Don't do it. And can you hear the Galatians arguing with Paul? We don't get their argument because it's a one-way letter. But I imagine it went something like this. Yeah, Paul, we get all that. But see, the problem is, you're saying this love of God stuff, it's for all people, and just anyone can come in. Sounds like a hippie movement to me. Yeah, Paul, where's the requirements? Where's the membership fees? Paul, where's a little bit of God's judgment and wrath so we can create rules to keep people out, so we can let people know they're really not good enough? And Paul, maybe your problem is you just want everyone to like you, and that's cheap grace. And can't you hear Paul respond? No. There's nothing cheap about this grace. This grace is for people like me. Don't you remember? I'm the one who was persecuting the church. I'm the one who was bringing destruction. I was walking on my way to Damascus to create more havoc. And I had an experience with God there. Light was brought down. I was blinded. Scales came to my eyes. A few days later, these scales fell, and I could see again. I could see the harm and destruction I had brought to the church. This is my story. The entire letter of Galatians is framed on Paul's story. He shares it in 5 verses in the first chapter. He tells it like this. He says, am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin, nor did I receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Not was I just taught this stuff, I actually experienced it with the risen Christ. In verse 13, you have heard no doubt of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among who? Among the Gentiles. Paul's plea to the Galatians. Don't buy into the gospel of fear. It is for freedom you have been set free. In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. There is neither slave nor free, nor male nor female. We are all one in Christ. You have been set free. Perhaps you grew up with all sorts of different gospels. Gospels that taught you how to do a really great job at creating new laws, new regulations to keep others out, to keep even yourself out. Perhaps you grew up with all sorts of different gospels. Gospels that taught you how to do a really great job at building barriers between yourself and others, or between yourself and God. And like the Galatians, you know exactly what it's like to run away from grace. Because the truth is, laws and rules and religious, rigid answers will always be an easier path than grace. But the good news is better. The good news of Jesus Christ is better. No fear, burning things in the street, keeping distance between me and people who aren't like me, being slow to forgive, slow to bless. Don't buy into the gospel of fear. For freedom, you have been set free. some gospels need to be buried, don't they? So each week in this Galatians One Love series, we will have a storyteller share their story of how barriers are being knocked down in their lives. So Michelle Mostavy, I want to invite you forward. We have a great list of storytellers, by the way, for the next 6 weeks. Some great people. You're going to hear some great stories. I've invited Michelle to be here this morning. Thank you for being here, by the way.
Thanks for having me.
Keep in mind, we only have a few minutes, so they can't dive deep into their story. But she has, for the last couple of years, since I've known her, and by the way, she's been here at St. Luke's for about 6 years.
Yep, that's about right.
But for the last couple of years, she's been asking some big, deep, real questions about life and God and faith. And all of this kind of stems from the ending of a relationship. And she's going to share this morning about those barriers of fear and how they're actually coming down. So I'm going to throw it to you, Michelle. Tell us about some fear.
Well, like you said, probably about 2.5 years ago, we realized that we were at a pretty major crossroad within our relationship. And when you realize that, there is a lot of fear because you see a lot of different paths laid out before you, and all of them are just full of unknowns. So it brought up a lot of questions for me about family and relationships and God and how God fits within those relationships.
And so tell us, when those questions came up, what did you do with them? Where did these questions lead you?
Right. Well, for those of you who know me, they know I like to talk a little bit. So, I really started taking those questions into different groups. So I got involved with some of the Communitas groups within St. Luke's and the Feeding of the 5,000. I also went on the Mom's Retreat. I read a lot of books, and I had a lot of conversations about those books within those groups and with family and friends. I guess it just kind of got me engaged in a dialogue that helped me explore some of those questions a little bit more.
And so share with us a little bit, if I can put you on the spot, what, as you're asking these big questions, as you're diving into community, what, if you could put it in a sentence or a phrase, what was the big fear?
The big fear for me was probably being confident that I could find the right path. I was really afraid of making a mistake and how that would influence the people that I really loved the most. So through those conversations, I think I started to realize that there isn't one right path, that there are a lot of different paths that we can take. I thought that the right path is where I was going to find God, and what I realized is that God was with me all the time, and He was with me while I was making these choices, and He is with me now as I continue to walk my way through life. So it's really changed the way I look at fear and the way I look at the unknown. I'm not afraid to ask those questions anymore. I'm not afraid to make mistakes because I know He's with us and loves us all the time.
And tell us, what has this particular community meant to you, or how have they played a role in this, breaking down barriers of fear?
Yeah, the community here is just incredible. There are a lot of really strong and amazing people, and they have helped lift me up during some of my hardest times. And they also helped me celebrate through some of my most joyful times, and it's something I'm just always very grateful for.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
So each week, we're going to be tearing down some barriers together, because the goal is to get rid of that big, colorful barrier. This week, we start with fear. So shall we remove fear? Sometimes we got to get rid of these things, hand them over, because they're too heavy. They're too big. Some gospels are too heavy to carry, so we simply hand them over. Shall we?